I never thought that the later years of my life would feel so quiet and yet so unbearably loud inside my own head. A strange contradiction that has become my daily companion ever since my wife passed away 6 years ago, and my only son, Brian, began drifting further and further from me, not in distance, because he still lives only 30 miles away in Minneapolis, but in every way that matters, in his attention, in his warmth, in his willingness to listen to me as a man and not just as an aging relic who has outlived his usefulness. I am 74 years old, and though my body has weakened, my knees ache in the mornings, my breath shortens when I walk too far, and my hands tremble slightly when I hold a cup of coffee, I have never considered myself feeble, not in spirit, not in mind, not in dignity. Yet with every passing year I feel the world, and even my own family trying to convince me otherwise, as if age alone had stripped me of the right to speak with weight, as if my tears or my laughter had lost meaning simply because they come from a face lined by time. Each morning follows the same routine, a small ritual that both comforts me and underscores how alone I am. I rise slowly from the bed I once shared with Margaret, shuffle into the kitchen, grind beans by hand because the electric grinder is too harsh for my ears, and brew coffee the way she used to, strong and dark with a faint hint of cinnamon. The smell fills the house, and for a moment I imagine her humming by the window, watering the flowers, calling me over to taste her pancakes. But the illusion breaks as soon as I carry the cup into the living room, where only the clock ticks and the chairs sit empty. I keep the television on during the day, just for noise. Yet more often than not, I turn the sound low, because the constant chatter of strangers makes the silence feel even more profound, as though it mocks me with the reminder that life is happening out there, somewhere beyond the thin walls of this small house, while I am merely a spectator waiting for visits that rarely come. Brian calls when it is convenient for him, usually while driving or standing in line somewhere, short bursts of conversation that feel more like obligations than genuine attempts at connection. "How are you, Dad?" Followed by, Yeah, that's good." And then, "Listen, I have to run." I understand he is busy. Of course I do. He has his own life, his own career in marketing, his wife, his young son, and the constant race to keep up with bills and expectations. I try to be sympathetic, but the truth gnaws at me. He rarely asks questions that matter, never sits down to truly hear about my memories, my regrets, my fears. When he does come by, perhaps once every couple of months, his visits carry a restless energy, as though the walls of this old house suffocate him. He glances at the dusty furniture, the faded photographs, and I sense in his eyes that he sees decay, burden, weight, when all I want him to see is the history, the love, the decades of work and sacrifice that built the life he now takes for granted. The hardest part of these years is not the solitude itself, but the feeling that my presence is a reminder of mortality to others, even to my son. People avert their eyes when they see tears in an old man's face. They are quick to change the subject when I speak of death, of memory, of longing. With Margaret gone, my confidant and partner of nearly 50 years, I find myself rehearsing conversations in my head that never happen aloud. I tell her about the aches in my legs, about the way the sparrows still come to the feeder she bought, about the way Brian seems less like my child and more like a stranger who visits out of duty. Sometimes I whisper apologies for things I never said when she was alive, for moments of stubbornness, for times when I thought there would always be tomorrow. The walls keep my secrets, and the shadows in the hallway have become my audience. I know I am not the easiest man to be around. Age sharpens certain edges and softens others. I can be bitter when I feel dismissed, defensive when I feel invisible. Yet what I cannot accept, what burns inside me, is the slow erosion of respect. In my youth, I worked as a school teacher, guiding students through history and literature, urging them to think deeply about human dignity, about how every generation must recognize the sacrifices of the ones before. To now be treated like an inconvenience, like a piece of furniture gathering dust, feels like the cruelest irony. I do not ask for grand gestures. I do not ask for constant attention. I ask only for recognition that I am still here, that my emotions are not entertainment, that my tears are not a joke to be shared with strangers. The house itself mirrors my state of mind. The paint is peeling slightly on the porch. The garden Margaret tended so lovingly has grown wilder, though I still cut the grass out of habit. Inside, photographs line the shelves. My wedding day. Brian as a child holding a baseball bat. Family trips to the lake. These frozen moments seem almost accusatory now, as if asking, what happened to us? Sometimes, when I dust the frames, I catch sight of my own reflection and barely recognize the face staring back. The years have reshaped me, but the memories remain sharp. I can still recall the scent of Margaret's perfume, the sound of Brian's laughter when he was 5 years old, the weight of responsibility when I bought this house with money scraped together from endless overtime. All of that history sits silently, while my son, the very person who inherited everything we built, treats it as though it were already debris waiting to be cleared. The world outside has changed faster than I can grasp. Brian lives online, in constant dialogue with people I will never meet, sharing meals, thoughts, and even quarrels with an audience of strangers who reward him with likes and emojis. I tried once to watch one of his videos, but I could not understand why anyone would want to broadcast such trivialities, why anyone would want to make a spectacle out of their private lives. He laughed when I asked, told me I was old-fashioned, that I didn't understand how things work now. Perhaps he is right. Perhaps I don't. But what I do understand is that the sanctity of family, of trust between father and son, should never be reduced to entertainment. I fear he has blurred the lines so deeply that he no longer distinguishes between sincerity and performance. When he visited last winter, we argued about the house. He said it was too big for me, that I should sell it, that I should move into an apartment, or even consider assisted living. The suggestion felt like a knife. This house is not just wood and brick. It is the vessel of my entire life, of Margaret's laughter echoing down the hall, of Brian's first steps across the kitchen floor. To leave it would be to surrender the last tangible connection to everything I hold dear. I tried to explain this, but he rolled his eyes, said I was being sentimental, irrational. I felt a lump in my throat, and I swallowed it down, because I did not want him to see me cry. But that night, after he left, I sat in Margaret's armchair and wept silently until the dawn broke. I never imagined that those tears, or others like them, would one day be captured not with compassion, but with a lens, not held in private, but exposed to the gaze of thousands of strangers. In all my years of teaching, of raising a family, of carrying burdens without complaint, the one thing I believed sacred was the intimacy of pain, the right to grieve without fear of ridicule. Yet as I sit here now, recalling the chain of events that followed, I realize that my own son, the boy whose hand I once held across the street, the man I believed would one day carry my legacy with pride, saw my sorrow not as a cry for understanding, but as an opportunity for content. And from that decision, from that single cruel act, everything else unraveled. It happened on a damp afternoon in early March, when the thawing snow made the yard muddy and the sky hung low with gray clouds. And I remember because I had just returned from the grocery store, dragging 2 heavy bags up the porch steps, when Brian pulled into the driveway without warning, his car door slamming shut with the impatience that always seemed to follow him like a shadow. He rarely arrived unannounced, and for a moment my heart quickened with the foolish hope that perhaps he simply wanted to see me, that perhaps he remembered the small rituals we used to share, coffee in the kitchen or a short walk around the neighborhood. But as soon as I saw the determined set of his jaw, I knew there was an agenda. He entered the house briskly, brushing past me, glancing at the faded curtains and sighing at the clutter of newspapers on the table, as if each detail of my existence were a personal offense to his sense of modern order. He began speaking before I had even sat down, saying again that the house was too large for me, that I was endangering myself by climbing the stairs, that it made no sense for an old man to cling to what he called a relic of the past. And his words carried the sharpness of someone rehearsing a speech he had given already to others, perhaps to his wife or to friends, as if my life could be summarized in a bullet point about inefficiency. I tried to remain calm, to remind him that this was my home, that it held the memory of his mother, that it was not simply about space, but about identity. But he would not listen, his voice rising, his hands gesturing with the confidence of someone who believes he has the authority to dictate another person's choices. My throat tightened as I realized that once again he did not see me, did not hear me, did not recognize that my tears and fears were as real as his ambitions. And in that moment, something inside me broke. I felt the heat rush to my face, my eyes filling with tears, and before I could stop myself, I was sobbing, not with the quiet dignity I usually try to maintain, but openly, my shoulders shaking, my voice catching as I tried to speak, though the words made little sense. I remember saying his mother's name, telling him that she would never have wanted this, that she had loved this house, that she had wanted us to stay rooted. And I cried for her, for myself, for the years of being dismissed. For a fleeting instant, I thought my vulnerability might reach him, that seeing his father in such raw pain would soften the hardness in his eyes. But instead, he did something I could not have anticipated, something that turned that private moment into the seed of my greatest humiliation. He pulled his phone from his pocket, tilted it toward me, and with a strange mixture of amusement and irritation, told me to just let it out, because people need to see what it's like dealing with you. At first, I didn't fully grasp what he meant. I thought perhaps he was making a cruel joke, but then I saw the tiny red light on the screen and realized he was recording me, capturing my grief as though it were a performance to be consumed. My instinct was to turn away, to shield myself, but my body was too heavy, my hands trembling, and I sat frozen as he circled slightly, angling the phone to capture the tears on my face, the way my voice cracked when I whispered that I missed his. "Mother," I told him to stop, my voice breaking, but he only laughed lightly and said, "Dad, relax. It's just a video. Maybe it will even help you get some sympathy." He had no understanding that sympathy given by strangers in the digital void is not comfort. That true comfort comes only from the embrace of someone you trust. And in that moment, he was stripping trust from me more cruelly than any argument ever could. The betrayal stung sharper than the cold wind that whistled through the crack in the window. This was my son, my own blood, and he was treating me not as a father, but as a subject, a spectacle, a character to be shaped and posted. I felt humiliated, violated, and yet powerless, because the authority I once had over him as a child had long since eroded, and now the balance of power had shifted entirely. He held the camera, he held the narrative, he held my dignity in his palm, ready to upload it to a world that had no context for my tears. No memory of the man I had been before age bent my back, and sorrow hollowed my chest. After he finished recording, he pocketed the phone with a satisfied air, saying almost casually that he might share it because people love authentic stuff. and that maybe I would even go viral, as though virality were some form of redemption, some twisted currency of value. I sat silently, my face wet, my heart pounding with shame, and I wanted to scream at him that authenticity is not something you exploit, that my grief is not his ladder to attention, but the words tangled in my throat, too exhausted to fight. He patted my shoulder with a gesture that felt more mocking than comforting, told me I should get some rest, and then left, leaving me in the heavy silence of the living room with nothing but the echo of my sobs and the knowledge that something irreversible had just occurred. That night I could not sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining where that video might end up. Who might see it? Whether he truly intended to share it, or whether it was just another cruel bluff. The idea of strangers watching me cry, of colleagues from my teaching days stumbling upon it, of neighbors whispering behind closed doors, filled me with dread. I had always believed that the home was a sanctuary, that within these walls my weakness was safe. But now even here I felt exposed. My mind spun through possibilities, each more terrible than the last, and I felt myself shrinking inside, as though my very identity were being erased by that glowing screen. The next morning, when I finally dozed off and then woke to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand, I saw messages from acquaintances I had not spoken to in years, each one hesitant, awkward, asking if I was all right, if I needed help, some even attaching links. My hands shook as I tapped the screen, and there it was. My face, swollen and red, my voice breaking as I spoke Margaret's name, my body slumped like a broken reed. The caption Brian had written above the video was short, almost playful. When your dad just can't handle reality anymore. My heart stopped. He had done it. He had turned my private breakdown into public content. I sat there staring at the screen, unable to breathe, feeling as if the walls of the room were closing in, because now it was no longer just a betrayal between father and son. It was a betrayal before the entire world. And though I did not yet know how far the ripples would spread, though I could not yet imagine the storm that would follow, in that moment I understood that the line had been crossed, that something sacred had been shattered, and that nothing between us would ever again be the same. When I saw the video already loose in the world, no longer in my son's pocket, but floating in the endless current of strangers' feeds, the first sensation was not anger, not even sadness, but a kind of hollow disbelief, as though I had slipped out of my own body and was watching someone else's humiliation. Some frail old man caught crying in his living room, unaware that a camera was pointed at him, unaware that his own son was turning him into spectacle, and it took me a long minute before I accepted that the figure on the screen was me, that the wet cheeks, the trembling lips, the incoherent words about Margaret were my own, that my grief had been stolen, packaged, and released to the appetites of an audience that devours such things without reflection. The comments began flowing quickly, a stream beneath the video, and I could not resist reading, though each word felt like a lash. Some laughed outright, writing little barbs about Grandpa Meltdown or someone get this man a retirement home. Others offered pity in the shallow way that online strangers do, tossing out phrases like, so sad lol, or this is why old people shouldn't be left alone. And still others mocked more cruelly, imitating my broken voice with written gibberish. Twisting my pain into a meme, I should have closed the screen, should have turned the phone off and shielded myself, but curiosity mixed with horror kept me scrolling, and soon I saw comments that cut deeper because they were not about me directly, but about Brian. People asking how he could do this to his father, asking what kind of son points a camera at his parent in such a state, asking why he thought this was acceptable. The divide in the comments confused me, for half of them saw me only as comic material, while the other half condemned him, but in either case as a stripped of dignity, reduced to an object, either of ridicule or of pity, neither of which I had sought. I felt exposed, naked in a way I had never felt, even in moments of real vulnerability. Because grief shared in the presence of a loved one is one thing. Grief displayed to strangers is another entirely. And I realized that the sanctity of privacy had been violated in a way that could never be undone. When Brian called later that day, his voice carried a strange pride, as though he expected congratulations, saying that the video was blowing up, that it had already been shared thousands of times, that people were engaging with it, that maybe we could even monetize it. And when he said we, I felt a sharp jolt in my chest. Because what he really meant was himself, his own channel, his own following, his own craving for validation. I tried to speak, my words halting, asking him if he understood what he had done, asking if he realized how ashamed I felt. But he brushed it off, laughing lightly, saying I was overreacting, that people cry all the time online, that authenticity is valuable, that I should be glad people were noticing me at all. His tone was not cruel in the overt sense, but in the dismissive way that wounds more deeply, because he did not see me as a father, but as raw material, and he could not fathom that dignity matters more than exposure, that some emotions are sacred. Precisely because they are not meant for the crowd, over the next days the situation escalated further, not just because the video spread, but because Brian leaned into it, responding to comments with jokes, posting follow-up clips where he mocked my stubbornness about the house, painting me as a cantankerous old man stuck in the past, a relic clinging to memories and refusing to face reality. And he even told anecdotes about me that were half true at best. Stories designed to entertain, but twisted in ways that made me seem ridiculous. I listened in disbelief as he described me forgetting to turn off the stove, which had never happened, or claimed that I once accused the mailman of stealing from me, another fabrication, and I realized he was crafting a caricature of me for his audience, a character they could laugh at, pity, shake their heads at, all while he collected their attention. The betrayal deepened with each post, because it was no longer a single lapse in judgment. It was a pattern, a deliberate choice to trade my image for his relevance. The phone began to ring with uncomfortable regularity, neighbors calling under the guise of concern. But I could hear the hesitation in their voices, the curiosity, the unspoken knowledge that they had seen me break down online. One even mentioned she had watched the clip with her grandchildren, who thought it was kind of funny, and she said it as though it were harmless. But I felt my stomach twist, because my pain had become entertainment in living rooms beyond my reach. I stopped answering the phone after that, stopped going out except when necessary, because I could feel eyes on me, imagined whispers following me down the grocery aisle. Though perhaps some of that was paranoia, it did not matter, because the damage was done. I no longer felt secure in my own community, no longer felt that I could walk with my head high. What stung most was the shift in how Brian looked at me. When he visited again, I hoped for remorse, for an apology. But instead, he acted as though nothing serious had happened, boasting that he was getting new followers, that people were demanding more, and he teased me, asking if I would cry again so he could capture part 2. I stared at him, speechless, unable to comprehend how the boy I raised, the child I once carried on my shoulders, the young man I supported through college, could regard me with such detachment, as if I were a stranger I had stumbled upon and decided to exploit. When I finally found the words, telling him I felt betrayed, that I had lost trust in him, his expression hardened, and he snapped that I was being dramatic, that I should be grateful he cared enough to even visit, that most old men my age were ignored completely. His words struck like blows, each one erasing decades of sacrifice, of love, of fatherhood, until I sat there in silence, too weary to argue. That evening, after he left, I returned to the video one last time, forcing myself to watch it from beginning to end, listening to the way my voice cracked, watching the tears trace down my cheeks, hearing the faint scoff in Brian's voice behind this camera. And I realized with devastating clarity that the person in the video was no longer me in the eyes of the world, but an image, a meme, a symbol for whatever narrative people wanted to project. I had lost ownership of my own grief. And as the video continued to circulate, as more and more people weighed in with their casual cruelty or shallow sympathy, I felt the walls of my life narrowing, pressing in on me, leaving me suffocated by shame and anger that had nowhere to go. That was the first escalation. Not simply the release of the video, but the realization that my private sorrow had been weaponized, that my son was complicit in turning me into a character, and that the world was eager to consume me without care for the man I truly was. It was the moment when the betrayal solidified, when hope that this was a mistake dissolved, when I understood that my humiliation was not temporary but permanent, etched into the endless archive of the Internet, and that the line between father and son had fractured beyond repair. The breaking point came not from the humiliation of the neighbors or the endless stream of strangers mocking me online, but from the moment I accidentally stumbled upon the video again, not on my phone, where I had already tried to avoid it, but on the EI screen of a laptop in the library when I went there one afternoon to read the newspaper and escape the confines of my silent house. I sat down at a public table, opened the browser to check the weather, and there it was on the home page of a news site, my own face distorted by tears, my voice captured in a cruel headline that read, "Elderly Father Breaks Down in Viral Clip." And underneath, the article dissected me as though I were a case study, describing me as an emblem of generational conflict, turning my private collapse into some shallow cultural talking point. My heart raced, and I wanted to shut the screen. But something held me, a grim curiosity, and I scrolled further, discovering that the clip had been shared not only on social media, but on talk shows, on podcasts, even on morning television segments, where hosts chuckled nervously and asked why a son would film his father instead of comforting him. For the first time, I saw the backlash against Brian not as a trickle of comments, but as a tidal wave. Thousands of strangers condemned him, some calling him heartless, others labeling him abusive, and still others going further, saying he deserved to lose his job, that he should be reported, that he was exploiting an old man who clearly trusted him. In that moment I felt a strange mixture of emotions, because part of me, the wounded part, felt vindicated, felt as though finally the world could see what I had endured, that my son's betrayal was not a figment of my imagination, but a truth visible to anyone with eyes. Yet another part of me recoiled at the exposure, because my dignity was still sacrificed, my tears still entertainment. Only now the moral balance was shifting, and the audience's outrage had turned against him. That evening Brian called, but this time his voice was not triumphant or dismissive. It was tense, strained, brittle at the edges, and he asked me if I had seen the coverage, if I understood that people were attacking him, that colleagues at his office were whispering that his manager had pulled him into a meeting and questioned his judgment, warning that such a display could harm the company's image. He tried to put the blame on me, saying if I had not been so emotional, if I had not cried like that, none of this would have happened. And hearing those words, I felt a surge of anger rise in me, sharper than any before, because he still could not accept responsibility, still twisted the narrative to make himself the victim, when in truth he had chosen to press record, he had chosen to upload, he had chosen to laugh while I wept. My voice trembled with fury as I told him that he had betrayed me, that his suffering now was only the harvest of what he himself had sown. And for a moment there was silence on the line, the silence of a man realizing that the walls were closing in. The days that followed became surreal. I heard from people I had not spoken to in decades, some reaching out in kindness, others merely curious, and I felt overwhelmed by the strange duality of being both invisible in my daily life and yet hypervisible in the digital sphere. My grief, my humiliation, my very face had become public property, discussed by strangers who knew nothing of me, while the man who should have shielded me from harm was scrambling to contain the consequences of his own cruelty. At night I found myself torn between pity and bitterness, because as much as I loathed what Brian had done, he was still my son, still the boy Margaret and I had raised, and hearing that he was being ostracized, mocked, perhaps even punished at work, awakened the reflex of a father who wants to protect his child. Yet I could not ignore the truth. He had invited this storm, and now he was drowning in it. The midpoint of this entire ordeal was not simply the shift in public opinion, not simply the reversal of sympathy from me to him, but the realization that our relationship had crossed into uncharted territory, that my role as father and his role as son had been twisted beyond recognition. He had filmed me crying as though I were a character in his story. But now the world saw him as the villain, and in their eyes I was the wounded figure he had betrayed. This inversion of roles unsettled me, because I had never wanted to be pitied, never wanted to be cast as the helpless old man who needed protection from his own blood. And yet here I was, watching the narrative spin beyond my control, unable to reclaim my dignity without feeding the very spectacle that had consumed it. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker on, I understood with painful clarity that something irreversible had happened. Brian's life was unraveling because of the choice he made, and my own life had been exposed because of the weakness I could not hide. We were bound together now not by love, not by shared memory, but by a viral wound that strangers debated endlessly. That was the true turning point, the midpoint, where everything tilted, because until then I had clung to the fragile hope that we might repair what had been broken, that perhaps an apology or time might soften the wound. But in that moment, I knew better. We had passed the point of no return, and what lay ahead would only sharpen the conflict, not resolve it. What followed in the weeks after that public turning point was a descent not only for Brian, but for me as well, though in very different ways, because while his reputation crumbled under the weight of outrage, I found myself forced to confront truths about our family, our history, and the son I thought I knew but perhaps never truly understood. The backlash against him grew quickly, far beyond the small circle of friends and acquaintances who had first commented. Major platforms were filled with debates about exploitation of the elderly. Hashtags emerged calling for accountability, and even advocacy groups reached out to me privately, offering legal help, counseling, or at least statements of support, all of which left me both bewildered and weary, because I had never sought any of this attention, had never wanted to become a symbol of anything. I was merely a man who had broken down in front of his son, expecting comfort, and instead had been turned into a cautionary tale for a society obsessed with recording everything. Brian, on the other hand, refused to admit wrongdoing. When we spoke on the phone, his voice was sharp, almost accusatory, telling me I had ruined his life, that my inability to control my emotions had cost him his career. because after his employer received a flood of complaints, they suspended him and later let him go, citing damage to the company's image. He raged that the internet had misjudged him, that he was the real victim of a culture that devours people. And when I tried to remind him that he had chosen to post the video, he shouted that if I had acted like a man instead of weeping like a child, none of it would have happened. Those words pierced me, not because they were true, but because they revealed the depth of his contempt, a contempt that must have been festering for years, hidden under casual politeness, surfacing only now when the weight of consequences pressed down on him. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that his actions had not been accidental or impulsive, but part of a mindset in which he saw me less as a father and more as raw material. A stubborn old man whose quirks could be commodified. He admitted, almost without shame, that he had considered starting a whole series about life with a difficult dad, where he would document my supposed forgetfulness, my resistance to change, my emotional outbursts, painting himself as the long-suffering son saddled with an impossible parent. Hearing this nearly broke me, because it meant that my humiliation was not just an isolated betrayal, but a strategy, a plan, a narrative he had been shaping. My life, my dignity, the very fabric of my existence, had become his storyline. And though the world had turned against him, I could not forget that had public opinion gone the other way, he would have continued expanding the archive of my shame for likes and profit. The escalation deepened when members of his own household became entangled. His wife, Julia, called me one evening, her voice tight with frustration, saying that she had begged Brian not to post that video, that she knew it would only bring pain, but he dismissed her, insisting it would make him successful. She confessed that their marriage had been strained for years, that he was consumed by the need to prove himself online, always measuring worth in views and engagement, neglecting his responsibilities at home. I listened quietly, torn between sorrow and anger, because while part of me wanted to console her, another part could not ignore that she too had remained silent while he ridiculed me, that only now, when the consequences touched her life, did she reach out. Their son, my grandson, barely 16, even wrote to me in a trembling message, apologizing for his father's behavior, saying he had defended me at school when classmates mocked the video, which had circulated among teenagers as a cruel joke. I felt both pride and shame reading his words. Pride that the boy had courage, shame that he had to defend a grandfather whose tears had become entertainment. Brian himself grew more hostile as the weeks went on. He came to my house unannounced, pounding on the door, demanding that I speak in his defense, that I issue a public statement saying I had consented to the recording, that I was not harmed, that it was all a misunderstanding. He shouted through the door that I owed him this, that after all he had done for me, I could not abandon him now. And I stood on the other side of the wood, my hand on the knob, trembling with the desire to open it and scream at him. But I did not, because I realized that engaging would only feed his delusions. When he finally left, the silence that followed was heavier than any noise, and I sank into a chair, my body shaking, realizing that my own child had become a stranger who saw me not with love, but with resentment and calculation. Rumors began to swirl that he was trying to sell interviews, to pitch his side of the story to outlets hungry for controversy. And when one of those surfaced online, I forced myself to read it. In it, he painted me as unstable, claiming I cried constantly, that I exaggerated the past, that I was manipulative, even suggesting that I had pressured him financially for years, turning the truth inside out. Reading those words, my chest tightened with rage and grief, because I had never asked him for a dime, had given instead, helping him through college, helping with down payments, offering what I could, and now he recast generosity as exploitation. The betrayal sharpened into something almost unbearable, because lies in the mouths of strangers sting, but lies from your own child cut to the bone. It was around this time that I began to understand his deeper motives. Friends of his, people who contacted me quietly, explained that Brian had been struggling financially for months, that his online ventures were not paying off, that he was desperate for attention, for any kind of success. And when he saw me break, down in tears, he did not see a father in pain. He saw content. He saw a clip that might go viral, and in his desperation, he chose to sacrifice me. Realizing this did not soften my anger. It only deepened it, because desperation may explain, but it does not excuse betrayal. He had stood at a crossroads where he could have offered compassion or exploitation, and he chose the latter, revealing the truth of his character. The second escalation was not merely the collapse of his public image, but the unmasking of his intentions, the exposure of how far he was willing to go to save himself, even at my expense. He no longer saw the damage done to me as relevant. Instead, he saw me as an obstacle standing between him and redemption. He pleaded, demanded, threatened, oscillating between self-pity and rage, each conversation with him like walking on a tightrope stretched over a chasm of resentment. At times I even feared he might harm me, not physically perhaps, but legally or reputationally, twisting stories until the blame fell squarely on me. And this fear, new and corrosive, hollowed me further. One night, unable to sleep, I sat in Margaret's old chair and thought about the son I had raised, the boy I once carried to the park, the teenager I watched graduate, the man I supported as he built his own family. And I wondered when the fracture had begun, when the boy who once looked at me with admiration had shifted into the man who now saw me as exploitable. Perhaps it had been slow, unnoticed, small resentments calcifying into contempt, or perhaps it had always been there, buried, waiting for circumstance to bring it forth. Whatever the truth, it was clear that the bond between us had deteriorated past repair, that even if the world forgave him, I could not. The escalation culminated in a moment that remains burned into my memory. He returned to my house after weeks of silence, his eyes bloodshot, his hands shaking, and he accused me to my face of destroying his future. He said I had betrayed him by not standing beside him, that my silence was proof I never loved him, that I wanted to see him fail. I looked at him, at the man my son had become, and for the first time I felt no urge to argue, no urge to defend myself, only the heavy clarity that he had chosen this path. I told him quietly that he had betrayed himself long before he betrayed me, that all I had ever wanted was to be respected as a man, not paraded as a joke, and that until he understood that, he would remain lost. He stood there trembling, rage and desperation etched into his face, then turned and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the wall shook, leaving me in a silence that was not empty, but final, a silence that marked the death of something between us. The breaking storm arrived on a Sunday evening when Brian demanded that we sit down together for what he called a family dinner, insisting that his wife and their son be present because he wanted, in his words, to clear the air once and for all. I knew before I even walked into their house that this would not be reconciliation, that it would be confrontation. Yet something inside me urged me to go, perhaps a final test of whether there remained even a fragment of the bond I once believed. Unshakable. The dining room was bright with too much light, the table set carefully, but the atmosphere was taut. Every gesture weighted with unspoken accusation. Julia sat with her hands folded tightly, her eyes darting between us. Their boy kept his gaze on his plate, clearly embarrassed, and Brian began to speak with the forced composure of a man who has rehearsed his grievances 100 times. He accused me directly of destroying his career, of letting strangers dictate our private lives, of refusing to support him publicly. And each sentence was sharper than the last, until he was no longer composed, but shouting, his fists slamming the table so hard the cutlery jumped. I listened in silence at first, letting him pour out his fury. But as his words grew crueler, calling me weak, manipulative, selfish, accusing me of enjoying his downfall, something inside me hardened. For months I had endured humiliation, pity, the shame of being reduced to a caricature online. But in that moment, faced with the raw venom of my own son, I felt a clarity that had eluded me. I told him in a steady voice that he had betrayed me, not the other way around, that he had filmed me in my most vulnerable moment and paraded it for strangers, that he had chosen to turn his father into a spectacle instead of an elder worthy of respect, and that the consequences he now faced were nothing more than the echo of his own actions. The words surprised even me, because I spoke them without anger, without tears, but with the calm weight of truth, and I saw them land on him like stones. He tried to shout me down, but I did not stop. I told him that I had carried him as a child, that I had sacrificed for his education, that I had stood by him through failures and hardships, and that never once had I asked for repayment, only for dignity, only for the simple recognition of my humanity. I told him that when he lifted that phone and pressed record, he had severed something deeper than trust. He had cut through the very fabric of our relationship, and that no amount of excuses or self-pity could repair what he had destroyed. My voice rose finally, not in a shout, but in the tremor of conviction, as I told him that a man is measured not by his followers, not by his views, not by the shallow applause of strangers, but by how he treats those who trust him most, and by that measure he had failed utterly. For a long moment the room was silent, except for the sound of my breathing. Julia's eyes glistened as if she wanted to speak but could not. Their son stared openly now with something between fear and respect, and Brian sat frozen, his mouth half open, the anger in his face flickering into something more fragile, though whether it was shame or merely shock I could not tell. He muttered that I was cruel, that I did not understand how hard life was for him, that I was old and out of touch, but the words no longer carried weight. They sounded hollow, rehearsed, and even he seemed to know it. He pushed back from the table, stood abruptly, and left the room, the slam of the door echoing through the house. And I sat there in the heavy silence that followed, feeling not triumph, not victory, but a strange calm, as though I had finally spoken the truth that had needed to be spoken, regardless of whether it was heard. The climax was not in his rage, or even in my defense, but in the quiet realization that I no longer feared his judgment, no longer sought his approval, no longer carried the desperate hope that he would see me for who I was. I had given him every chance to honor the bond between us, and he had chosen betrayal. Now I had answered not with fists, not with vengeance, but with words that laid bare the truth. For the first time in months I felt the weight lift slightly from my chest, not because the wound was healed, but because I had reclaimed my voice, my dignity, the right to say, I am a man, I am your father, and I will not be reduced to a spectacle. In the weeks after that final confrontation at Brian's table, my life settled into a strange and unexpected quiet. Not the heavy silence of shame that had filled the house before, but a gentler stillness, as though a storm had passed and left behind broken branches, yet also clearer skies. Brian stopped calling altogether, and though at first I waited by the phone, expecting perhaps an apology or at least a word of reconciliation, eventually I realized that the silence was not absence, but a kind of truth. He had chosen distance. He had chosen resentment, and I could no longer chase him. I walked through the rooms of my house with lighter steps, not because the pain was gone, but because I no longer carried the burden of unspoken words. I had told him everything, and whether he listened or not was no longer mine to control. The world, fickle as it always is, moved on quickly. The video that had once dominated comment sections and headlines was soon buried under new scandals, new spectacles, new stories that consumed the public's attention. Occasionally, someone would recognize me at the grocery store or church, offering a sympathetic nod or a brief word of kindness. But more often than not, I was left alone, free again to exist without being dissected. I discovered, almost with surprise, that solitude without humiliation can be peaceful, that a quiet evening with a book or the simple ritual of brewing coffee can carry a dignity of its own when no one is mocking you from behind a screen. What I had lost was undeniable. The trust between father and son, the possibility of growing old with his support, the comfort of knowing that my vulnerability would be met with love rather than exploitation. Yet in that loss there emerged something unexpected, a new circle of people who offered me solidarity. Neighbors who had once been distant began to stop by with small gestures, a meal left at the doorstep, an invitation to join them for church suppers, and slowly I felt less invisible. Even more surprising were the letters that came in the mail from strangers who had seen the video and felt compelled to reach out, not with pity, but with recognition, saying that they too had been betrayed by family, that they too had been turned into burdens rather than parents, that they too struggled with the loneliness of age. Their words, handwritten and imperfect, reminded me that my suffering was not singular, that across countless houses and lives, others carried similar wounds. I began attending the community center twice a week, something I had resisted for years, thinking it was a place only for the very old, the frail, the forgotten. But I found instead companionship, men and women with stories as heavy as mine, laughter that still broke through despite everything, resilience in faces marked by time. For the first time since Margaret's passing, I felt something stir in me that resembled belonging, not the belonging of family, perhaps, but of shared humanity. And in those rooms, I learned that survival after betrayal is not just possible, but necessary, that dignity is not something others can permanently take if you refuse to surrender it. As for Brian, his life unraveled further. From what I heard through whispers and glimpses online, jobs refused to hire him. His online presence dwindled. His reputation followed him wherever he went. And while part of me still ached to see my own son struggle, I could not ignore the truth. It was not my doing, not my silence, not my refusal to defend him that destroyed him, but his own choices. Perhaps one day he will see that. Perhaps not. But I no longer cling to that hope. My task now is not to fix him, not to wait for him, but to live whatever years remain to me with as much grace as I can. Sometimes, in the evening, I sit by the window and watch the sparrows gather at the feeder Margaret once placed, and I think of her voice, soft and steady, telling me that storms do not last forever, that wounds do not define us, that even betrayal can teach us something about strength. I whisper her name. I thank her for the years we had, and I find peace in the knowledge that though my son may have cast me aside, I am not erased, not broken beyond repair. The world saw my tears, yes, but it also saw his cruelty, and in that exposure a kind of justice was served. I remain here, alive, breathing, drinking my coffee, tending my small garden, carrying memories that no camera can capture, and that, in the end, is enough.